The following and all of our free content is brought to you by our sponsors and our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. When you can't come to Gettysburg, we want to bring Gettysburg to you, but that requires people and your support. So go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg and please become a patron today. And if you'd like to hear a little more discussion on the topic of today's lecture, well, we have a new episode with Dr. Titus that just released today. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. And we thank you in advance.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here. As always, we appreciate you carving out some time in your day to join us for the Winter Lecture Series. My name is Christopher Gwynn. I'm the Chief of Interpretation and Education here at the Park. And it is my distinct honor to introduce our guest speaker for today. Jill Titus is the Associate Director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College, where she teaches courses in modern American history, public history, African American history, and historical memory. She's also the co-coordinator of the college's public history minor, which is a fantastic addition to the school. She is the author of Gettysburg, 1963, Civil Rights, Cold War Politics, and Historical Memory in America's Most Famous Small Town, as well as many other books, articles, and journal entries in publications such as the Journal of Southern History, the Public Historian, History News, and the Journal of the Civil War Era. Dr. Titus is a great friend of both Gettysburg National Military Park as well as Eisenhower National Historic Site. I have it on good word that she at one time worked as a seasonal ranger for the National Park Service, so she has real street cred. Join me in welcoming Dr. Jill Titus to the lecture series.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you everyone for being here. It is really an exciting moment for me. I got my start in public history at this park at Eisenhower and at Gettysburg. Spent a summer as an interpreter at Eisenhower, spent a summer poking around in the collection, in the Gettysburg National Military Park collection in the basement of the old visitor center. So Gettysburg has been kind of a touchstone for me, a place that I have continually returned to throughout my life. So in a way, it's not at all surprising that I found a way to write a book about Gettysburg, despite the fact that I am a historian of the mid-20th century. I had to make it work. And finally, after 10 years at Gettysburg College, I found a way to do so. So I want to start today by painting a picture for you of what the summer of 1963 battle anniversary looked like here at Gettysburg. So a few weeks after his infamous stand in the schoolhouse door blocking desegregation of the University of Alabama, the nation's best known white supremacist, George Wallace, sat on a platform in front of the Peace Light. The date was July 1st, 1963, and surrounding him were governors, politicians, and dignitaries from across the nation, as well as hundreds of American families, eager to begin the official commemoration of the centennial anniversary of the most famous battle of the Civil War. For Wallace, the battle's meaning in the present-day world in which he lived and maneuvered was clear. Gettysburg was the high point of Confederate defense of states' rights and an enduring symbol of the rightness of that cause. It was also, in his mind, an important rallying point for mid-20th century white resistance to both the intensifying Black freedom struggle and escalating federal interference in the South in defense of Black rights. On the other side of the podium that day sat the Reverend Lena Parr, pastor of St. Paul's AME Zion Church, the oldest continually operating Black congregation in Gettysburg. Parr was on the platform that day because she had been invited as an officer of the local ministerial association to give the invocation opening the 3-day ceremony. Over the years that I have worked on this project, I have wondered again and again, what did she think? I have wished that I could get in her head. How did she, as a local, a woman, an African American, and a pastor, view the Battle of Gettysburg? did that field in front of her prompt her to reflect on the different ways that human beings draw on their theology or their ideas about the divine to justify or to make sense of war? Did she think about the black USCT soldiers who were buried not far away in Lincoln Cemetery, who had received little of the acclaim of the men who fought at Gettysburg and seemed largely forgotten by everyone but the local black community? How did she feel about the peace light? What was it like for her to stand in the shadow of a monument predicated on sacrificing racial justice on the altar of sectional peace, but know that her own presence there in a leadership role was an inherent challenge to this whitewashed memory of the Civil War? Could she see George Wallace from where she was sitting? If she had had 5 minutes to just speak freely to him, what would she have said? What did she hope that he, in particular, might hear in her prayer? When the appointed time came, she walked up to the podium and prayed for the nation, the world, the commemorative exercises, and the governors present. The full text of her prayer doesn't seem to have survived, but we know that she concluded by beseeching God that all races would come together as one. So we might know almost nothing about how she understood the battle itself, but these words, even though, it's a very short quote, these words give us a few important clues as to how she understood the battle's legacy. To 21st century audiences like ourselves, pleas for racial unity can sound very conciliatory, an extension of the peace light's historic emphasis on reconciliation. But we have to understand the context and the subtext involved here. As many of you know, the landscape surrounding the peace light has a complicated and at times menacing history. 40 years earlier, before the existence of the monument, Ku Klux Klan members from across Pennsylvania had staged a massive demonstration on this spot, attempting to link their vision of racial supremacy and white Christian nationalism to the courage and devotion of Civil War soldiers. For much of its history, the Peace Light has been a testament to a fairly vague but emotionally stirring sense of sectional reconciliation and national healing. Its design process, dedication ceremony, and patterns of popular usage all contributed to the disassociation of the war from the cause of racial justice. But its foundation literally rests on the work of black participants in a New Deal labor program, whose presence in Gettysburg in the 1930s was widely resented by local whites. Parr's leadership role on this spot in 1963 thus pointed back to previous generations of black Americans whose understandings of democracy and freedom, central concepts in the Gettysburg Address, repeatedly challenged the idea that peace could exist without justice. In addition to understanding the context of the physical location in which Parr offered her plea for racial unity, it's also really important to remember that she did so sharing the stage with a man who had staked his political career on the idea of segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Her prayer that all races would come together as one was really an inherent assertion of fundamental human equality that likely struck white supremacists like Wallace, fixated as they were on the purity of the so-called white race, that as an endorsement of racial mixing. In praying for racial unity on the spot that she did, with Wallace in the background, she employed the symbolic weight of this monument to advance a more liberating and more provocative vision of peace, one that demanded equity and mutual regard as the foundation for reconciliation. Parr's vision of reconciliation was a lot more expansive than the one held by the group that had invited her to pray that day. Like most architects of the official Civil War Centennial activities that took place between 1961 and 1965, when members of the Gettysburg Centennial Commission, also known as the GCC, envisioned reconciliation, they thought of white Americans on different sides of the Mason-Dixon line. Like their colleagues in the federally established Commemorative Commission, the U.S. Civil War Centennial Commission, GCC members worked hard to keep the focus of the Gettysburg commemoration on American patriotism, courage under fire, and sacrifice in the service of the nation. But try as they might to maintain control over the messaging of the event, they couldn't prevent alternate interpretations of the battle's meaning, like Parr's and Wallace's, from being shared with visitors. Parr's interpretation rejected sectional reconciliation in favor of racial reconciliation. 3 days after the opening ceremony, on July 4th, a group of activists with a vision of peace and reconciliation that was provocative in a different way came to the monument to stage a silent vigil for international peace and universal abandonment of arms. Against the backdrop of an increasingly hot Cold War, members of the York Action for Peace, a local group devoted to nuclear disarmament, saw Civil War history and battlefield monuments not as symbols of martial glory, but rather as reminders of the horror and destruction of war. As they stood in silence with their signs by the peace light, they undoubtedly got pushback from anniversary visitors over their supposedly unpatriotic desecration of the battlefield. But they also found some supporters. At least a few visitors joined the vigil, expressing a basic willingness, at least, to entertain the idea that commemorating the Civil War could be a springboard to peace work in the present. Despite all my research on this topic, I don't know how Lena Parr and George Wallace felt about sharing a platform or sharing a commemorative moment, although I can certainly make a few educated guesses. I also have no record of the discussions that members of the York Action for Peace held about staging a vigil over the anniversary, but I imagine that there were likely at least a few voices raised in protest. Clearly, all of these individuals had profoundly different understandings of the meaning and legacy of the Battle of Gettysburg and its relationship to the challenges of the present. What they shared, though, and this is the central point of what I want to talk with you about today, was a conviction that commemorating Gettysburg would help them achieve their goals in Cold War America, whether those goals were advancing or obstructing civil rights for Black Americans, encouraging American intervention abroad in the name of defending freedom around the globe, or advocating nuclear disarmament and a relaxation of tensions with the Soviet Union. So now that you hopefully have an intriguing picture of the anniversary commemoration sort of fixed in your mind, I'd like to step back a little bit and set the stage for how George Wallace and Lena Parr and these peace activists, among many others, came to fight the battles of the 1960s on an 1860s battlefield. The centennial anniversary of the Civil War took place from 1961 to 1965, which, as we all know, was a pretty eventful period, both across the U.S. and around the world. The world's two leading superpowers, the United States and the USSR, were locked in a Cold War struggle over which vision of the future would triumph, capitalism and democracy, or collectivism and communism. Colonial empires were collapsing around the globe, and dozens of newly independent nations with majority non-white populations were coming into existence in Africa and Asia and Latin America. Back home in the U.S., the modern civil rights movement was at its height, as were concerns about national security, particularly in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis in the fall of 1962. Americans, as they approached the anniversary of Gettysburg, were, with good reason, hyper-fixated on their image on the world stage. They wanted that image to be that of a prosperous people bound together by strong bonds of national kinship, deeply committed to democracy, and ready to give all in defense of both their country and its bedrock political principles. But the reality, as it usually is, was more complicated. The democracy many white Americans held up as inherently superior to communism was deeply flawed, and people around the world knew it. It had never delivered on the promise of equal rights for all. And 100 years after the war that had abolished racial slavery, Black Americans were in the midst of an all-out assault on the white supremacist system that replaced it. Many white Southerners responded to street demonstrations and marches and direct action protests like sit-ins with violence, attacking demonstrators with clubs, fire hoses, dogs, and more. White Southerners and political conservatives increasingly clashed as well, also sometimes violently, with federal officials, attempting to enforce court decisions and laws upholding equal opportunity. In addition to civil rights clashes, battles over civil liberties in wartime, Cold War time, were widespread as fears of communism continued to haunt most Americans and undermine progressive causes. The architects of the Centennial anniversary hoped that commemorating the war that had torn the nation apart could help bridge the divisions of the mid-20th century and rehabilitate the nation's image on the world stage. The Civil War, they thought, could be medicine for everything that ailed the U.S. It could boost patriotism, draw Americans together across regional and partisan divides, and remind them of how much they had in common. Thus, they committed themselves to a commemoration highlighting concepts like duty, sacrifice, and martial glory that would, in their minds, stiffen people's backbones in the present and spread patriotic narratives of American greatness. So to put it mildly, commemoration of the war did not work out the way these planners had envisioned. They wanted an inspirational celebration of martial masculinity that would hold up the common soldier of both armies as a unifying model of heroism and courage and patriotism for 20th century Americans, and on the side would also boost tourism to Civil War sites. This was not necessarily an achievable goal in the early 1960s. Many of these Centennial planners believed that it was possible to honor, or even in the early years, celebrate the Civil War without talking about the contentious historical issues that fueled and shaped it. When Black Americans like historians John Hope Franklin or Charles Wesley, or civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. called for a more inclusive interpretation of the Civil War era that would help contextualize contemporary struggles for civil rights, many Centennial planners basically turned a deaf ear, continuing on with programming that portrayed the Civil War along the lines of a football rivalry in which both sides were honored for their good plays. In their minds, the conflict's significance was rooted not in the emancipation of 4 million people or the resolution of fundamental questions about citizenship and federalism, but rather the war's role in paving the U.S.'s path toward 20th century superpower status. So for that reason, sentimental stories of soldierly self-sacrifice and brother meeting brother on the battlefield received top billing, while slavery and emancipation, political division, and continuing racial injustice were all but invisible. The first executive director of the Federal Commission to commemorate the war, Carl Betts, responded in 1960 to a reporter's question about how the commission planned to commemorate emancipation, with a frank admission that he had no plans to do so. He followed this with a rambling allusion to the myth of the Black Confederate and the trope of the loyal slave, insisting that a lot of fine Negro people loved life as it was in the Old South, and we want to honor that. This is 1960. Small wonder that Black leaders and white liberals called the Centennial an attempt to turn back the clock and sabotage the contemporary struggle for Black freedom by celebrating the Confederate cause. When the Civil War Centennial Commission announced that its 1961 annual gathering would be held in Charleston to coincide with the anniversary of Fort Sumter, at a whites-only hotel, 3 state commissions with Black members resolved to boycott the assembly. Civil rights groups like the NAACP and the Congress of Racial Equality also quickly began to mobilize their members in protest, to the consternation of Civil War Centennial Commission officials who feebly argued that there was nothing they could do to change city or state segregation laws. The Congress of Racial Equality, in particular, was all set to launch a picket line highlighting the Commission's misappropriation of Civil War history to legitimize racial discrimination, when last-minute pressure from the White House prompted the relocation of the assembly to the desegregated local naval base. The event was a flop. That's putting it mildly. It was racked by hostility between Northern and Southern delegations. There were angry calls for secession on the part of the Southern state commissions and bad publicity around the globe. One commentator quipped that the Centennial was such a windfall for the Soviets that he was starting to suspect that the whole idea of commemorating the war had originated not in Washington, D.C., but in Moscow. The Charleston fiasco was the most embarrassing moment of the Centennial period for the U.S. government, but it was only one example of the ongoing efforts made by Black Americans and progressive-minded allies to push back on interpretations of the war's legacy that marginalized Blacks or legitimized massive resistance to civil rights. Ironically, had early voices championing a central role for Gettysburg in the anniversary commemoration been listened to, the Charleston fiasco might never have happened. As preparations for this 100th anniversary intensified in the mid-1950s, some officials at the highest level of the National Park Service argued that the nation's and the agency's best interests would not be served by commemorating every aspect of a 4-year war. They pushed instead for a commemoration focused on Gettysburg, devoted to preserving unprotected lands and building a comprehensive new museum of the American Civil War. In so doing, they provided official federal confirmation of the popular belief that Gettysburg was the heart and soul of the nation's Civil War landscape. And these officials, led by Northeast Regional Director Daniel Tobin, warned that a program of commemorative activities helmed by a federal commission but largely carried out by local people around the country would run the risk of producing tacky celebrations, partisan debates, and, as they delicately noted, embarrassing incidents like the one that later played out in Charleston. Better to take a one-shot approach. Gettysburg was the best place to make the centerpiece of the nation's Civil War landscape, they argued, because most Americans already thought of it that way anyway. In making his case for Gettysburg, Tobin insisted that it was not only the most significant battlefield of the war, it was also a Union victory, had a history of being used for reconciliationist purposes, and was located north of the Mason-Dixon line, where he assumed tensions over segregation and federal authority would be less flammable. Like many white Northerners in this era and other eras, Tobin and his colleagues seemed to at least partly embrace the fallacy that racism and discrimination was an exclusively Southern problem. This was, of course, untrue. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania was a community with a long history of racial segregation. Calls for integrating local schools led to a Klan-sponsored cross-burning in the 1920s, and the appointment of a Black anthropologist, Lewis King, to a high-level position at Gettysburg National Military Park in 1934 sparked predictions of a race riot. Local movie theaters, restaurants, swimming pools, and other public spaces continued to openly bar or segregate non-whites into the early 1960s. And at the beginning of the Centennial era, Black Gettysburgians still faced pervasive discrimination in employment, housing, and education. Though less widespread than it had been just a few years earlier, segregation in public accommodations was still common enough in Adams County in 1963 that the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission launched a campaign to prevent discrimination against anniversary visitors. Representatives from the Human Relations Commission called on local business owners in person to remind them of the state's public accommodations law and to direct them to post non-discrimination notices in their windows throughout the summer of the anniversary. Ultimately, critics of the NPS plan for Gettysburg-centric Civil War Centennial won their day with their arguments that white Southerners would never stand for an exclusive focus on a Union victory, and that grassroots enthusiasm for commemorating the war in every corner of the country should be encouraged, not stifled. NPS officials nonetheless clung determinedly to one element of their vision: the creation of a new museum and visitor comfort facility at Gettysburg. When Richard Neutra's Cyclorama building was dedicated in 1962, NPS officials called it the agency's central contribution to the Centennial. I bet many of you know this building well, have a personal history with this building, as do I. Until its demolition in 2013, the Cyclorama building stood as permanent testimony to the influence of Cold War politics on the battlefield's commemorative landscape. If ever there was a building saddled with a grandiose vision, it was this one. Park Service officials wanted a building of a memorial nature, one that would serve visitors' practical needs and elevate the NPS presence in the community. Historians have described Gettysburg in the late 1950s as akin to Niagara Falls or Gatlinburg, essentially overrun with commercial development. I read one letter from an irate visitor describing the downtown area as highway robbery without the benefit of a gun. NPS staff complained that there were so many private museums and tour companies and entertainment venues in the community that many tourists had no idea that the battlefield was managed by the National Park Service. Tobin envisioned a new visitor center as an antidote to this problem, calling for, here I'm going to quote him, an appropriate centennial memorial, fully as fitting for prominence in the park as the many and varied types of commemorative monuments that now dot this great battlefield. This was supposed to be a monument. This was supposed to be a commemorative structure. So to create this functional centennial memorial, the NPS turned to internationally renowned architect Richard Neutra. Neutra formulated his design as both a living monument to Abraham Lincoln and a shrine for the free world. Some architectural historians, which I am definitely not, I can barely tell the difference between an eave and a cornice, have argued that the white of this building was meant to be reminiscent of white marble, signifying this identity as a memorial. And they've also suggested that the tinted glass of the windows was supposed to evoke the idea of memory, gesturing to historical figures who are no longer physically present, but nonetheless inscribed on the landscape. Some have even argued that Neutra's design actually should be understood as a visual realization of the father of NPS interpretation, Freeman Tilden's charge to the agency to animate its resources. The Cyclorama Center was a showcase of space-age technology, including louvered blinds that self-adjusted as the sun moved across the sky. It's pretty cool. Walls that retracted at the push of a button, and a sound and light show in the drum that housed Philip Petau's famous Cyclorama painting. After Star Trek premiered in 1966, some NPS people began calling the building the Starship Enterprise. I also heard NPS people call it other things, which I will not repeat here. But all the time, throughout these early years, this building was charged with a much higher mission than just providing visitors modern amenities. It was to be a three-dimensional teaching tool for democracy. By situating this kind of space-age technology at the heart of the battlefield landscape, the Cyclorama Center was designed to send a message about the advantages of Western capitalism and technology, and the superiority of American political principles as expressed in the Gettysburg Address. For Richard Neutra, the central reason the Battle of Gettysburg mattered was because it gave Lincoln the platform to make meaning out of suffering and articulate a vision of the United States as the world's shining example of government of the people, by the people, for the people. At the height of the Cold War, that was an interpretation of America's place in the world that was tailor-made for export. Neutra and his team thus designed Gettysburg National Military Park's first visitor center to be a place for foreign leaders to learn about American democracy and build political ties with the United States. The building's design revolved not just around the Cyclorama painting itself, but around plans for an annual international forum devoted to building peace among nations in a world threatened with atomic annihilation. The doors under the rotunda, right there, those dark ones, were designed to open at the push of a button, creating an indoor-outdoor auditorium to accommodate the expected crowds for these programs. And far from being just the architectural shell in which these programs would take place, Neutra saw the structure itself as almost transcendental in purpose. He told a group of contractors before ground was broken that the world leaders were going to have to keep their speeches brief because the building itself is most important and comes first. He later got into a bitter argument with park leadership when they proposed, in his words, to desecrate his design with exterior signage pointing visitors to the restrooms. He asked park staff if they would treat the Taj Mahal with such disrespect. I have not found a full-text account of their response, but my guess is that it began with, "Get over yourself. You know, this is a visitor center. People are coming here to get a map and use the bathroom. They're not coming to visit one of the architectural wonders of the world." Gettysburg Centennial Commission members were much less interested in architecture's potential as a Cold War tool than Neutra. But like the Civil War Centennial Commission, that federal body, they were determined to enlist both the battle and the Gettysburg Address in the service of the anti-communist crusade. The timing was a little difficult, though. The violent suppression of the 1961 Freedom Rides, the standoffs over desegregation at the University of Mississippi and University of Alabama, and a huge wave of direct action protests in the spring and summer of 1963 continually challenged the commemoration's core messages of unity and freedom and political self-determination. The battle anniversary summer began not with peaceful patriotic unity, but with the infamous attacks on children in Birmingham, Alabama, George Wallace's political theater in Tuscaloosa, and the murder of NAACP leader Medgar Evers, and ended with the March on Washington and the arrests of 15,000 people across the country for engaging in protests and demonstrations. As observers around the world, including key political allies, blasted the U.S. government for not doing enough to protect the freedoms and liberties of all of its citizens, the Gettysburg commemoration became a battle over the meaning of the battle and the address. African Americans and white liberals argued that the trope of the Brothers' War turned the Civil War into a meaningless bloodletting and divorced the conflict from the legacy of emancipation. The best way to honor those fallen at Gettysburg, they argued, was to embrace present-day actions to protect Black rights. Lost causers, on the other hand, insisted that Confederates had been freedom-loving Americans and proto-anti-communists, whose virtues entitled them to equal space and prestige on all battlefields of the war, including Gettysburg. They openly linked massive resistance to civil rights to the Confederate cause, calling on 20th century white Americans to continue the struggle against Northern aggression and federal tyranny. For their part, the Cold War moderates, who made up the GCC and other groups like it, scrambled to keep the commemoration on the consensus track, focused on their preferred themes of patriotism and unity and American greatness. In the end, they managed to maintain a good bit of control over the official commemorative activities, but substantial cracks in the reconciliationist veneer of the battle anniversary programming revealed the struggle for memory underneath. By November, when commemoration of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address took place, the ongoing Black freedom struggle had pushed the dial toward programming that was a little bit more inclusive, more intellectual in tone, and more open to the emancipationist interpretation of the war than the battle anniversary had been. So in the remainder of the time that we have today, I'd like to talk briefly about a handful of moments over the course of the 1963 anniversary year. All of them show very different interpretations and uses of Gettysburg's narrative. What they have in common, though, is they all reveal the utilization of the Centennial to make connections between civil rights struggles, foreign policy priorities, and the U.S. role internationally. The first of these moments took place in May at the annual Memorial Day ceremony at Soldiers National Cemetery, famous for its historic associations with the Gettysburg Address. The day's speaker, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, used his podium to respond to Martin Luther King Jr.'s recently published letter from a Birmingham jail, which skewered white moderates for their inaction on justice issues. So Johnson gave a super brief nod to the traditional Memorial Day theme of military sacrifice, but then he pivoted to civil rights. And he told his listeners that white Americans could no longer pretend that time alone was going to heal the nation's racial wounds. Concrete action was necessary. If the United States did not rise to the challenge of eradicating inequality, the vice president warned, the nation's future was at stake. Invoking the Cold War vision of America's special role in the world, Johnson insisted that the price of further inaction would be yielding up our destiny of greatness among the civilizations of history. As King pointed out in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, for generations, white Americans had asked their black counterparts for patience in the face of injustice, while doing not a lot to combat it. As the intensity of black protest escalated in the 1960s, these calls came with increasing frequency, as many whites recoiled from the unpleasantness and incivility of direct action protests. The Kennedy administration, which Johnson, of course, represented, had frequently begged black activists for de-escalation and cooling off. So in publicly acknowledging King's stinging rebuke to these pleas for quiet, here in Gettysburg, Johnson's speech shines a light on the transformative impact of the protests that had recently rocked Birmingham and laid the groundwork for his own presidential actions on civil rights just a few years later. But Johnson, of course, was a mainstream politician. He was not a civil rights activist or a man of color. So thus, he could recognize the emptiness of calls for patience while simultaneously asking African Americans to somehow still have faith in the workings of the law and keep their campaigns for reform limited to the courtroom. He never said it directly, but the Cold War concern that direct action protest exposed the United States to too much negative attention worldwide led him to counsel this court-centered approach, which embodied really the same problematic moderation that King had excoriated. Despite that, though, this was Johnson's first major statement on civil rights, and it played a role in prompting Kennedy to take a stronger stand on the issue. It also tried out some themes that Johnson would later use in the most important speech of his life, the Voting Rights Address. Okay, so 2 months after Johnson's speech, during the July battle anniversary, Congressman Sam Gibbons also spoke directly to the events in Birmingham, lamenting that racial discrimination was undermining the global struggle against communism. Gibbons was the keynote speaker at the July 3rd dedication of a new monument on Seminary Ridge to Confederate troops from the state of Florida. And he echoed some of the themes in Johnson's Memorial Day speech, drawing upon the experiences of Floridians at Gettysburg to make a case for limited civil rights reform, calculated to play well in the international media. Gibbons argued that, unlike Gettysburg, the effects of which were largely limited to the United States, the nation's contemporary conflicts had international significance. The U.S. could hardly claim to work on behalf of freedom and equality around the globe without practicing it at home. He condemned the snarling police dog, the fire hose, the electrically charged cattle prod, all attention-grabbing images of American racism running on the front page of newspapers around the world. The congressman told his listeners here at this monument that we cannot hope to win men's minds in the battle with communism if America becomes a land in which freedom, equality, and opportunity are reserved only for the white man. Gibbons's local context as a South Florida politician is key to understanding both his internationalist worldview and his framing of the battle. One of the reasons that the backlash in Birmingham moved many elite whites toward limited support of the Black freedom struggle was concern that escalating anger toward the U.S. on the African continent could jeopardize the nation's access to African uranium deposits and negate its edge in the arms race. This fear was shared by many people around the country, but the on-the-ground mobilization of South Florida in preparation for nuclear war the previous year remained a particularly vivid memory for residents of Gibbons's home state. Gibbons argued here at Gettysburg that a moderate middle way, was the only way forward. He called for an end to both white violence and demonstrations, deeming the only appropriate forum for change is to be the ballot box, the courtroom, and the legislative halls. What Gibbons was advocating for here at Gettysburg was an elite-managed program of slow and moderate reform achieved through existing legal and political structures, not a grassroots recalibration of American democracy. If this prescription was not followed, and the nation's security was jeopardized by losing allies in the United Nations or losing access to African uranium, he warned, those who died here and on other battlefields will then have died in vain. Gibbons openly placed the moral and constitutional aspects of the civil rights struggle as secondary to its role in Cold War politics, and actually voted against the Civil Rights Act the following year, although he did support the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Still, though, his willingness to acknowledge that the rights of citizenship shouldn't be reserved for whites alone, and his disruption of the equation of honoring the Confederate dead with massive resistance, which was embraced at many other spots on the battlefield that week, most famously by George Wallace, and we'll get there in a minute, are important. Okay, so let's turn back to Wallace. Whoops, there's Sam Gibbons again with JFK. Wallace's presence in Gettysburg over the battle anniversary coincided with his period of greatest influence as a symbol of white resistance. For all of his popularity back home in Alabama, Wallace had political ambitions outside his home state. And in addition to a seemingly genuine interest in the Civil War, he saw participation in the anniversary programming as an opportunity to start cultivating a national political following. His time in Gettysburg boosted his visibility on the national stage in advance of his later campaigns for the presidency. An Alabama newspaper argued that his popularity with anniversary visitors at Gettysburg was proof that the governor had become a rallying figure for whites who were sick of liberal politicians and afraid of Black activists. In addition to participating in other programs, Wallace was the featured speaker at the July 2nd dedication of a monument to Confederate troops from South Carolina, located not far from the new Florida one. He's not in this picture, but that is the monument. The South Carolina dedication ceremony was separated from the Florida one by only 1 day. But it defined the relationship between the legacy of the battle, the Black freedom struggle, and the Cold War very, very differently. At the South Carolina monument, the segregationists held court. The concern that discriminatory practices undermined the nation's foreign policy goals that motivated men like Sam Gibbons failed to resonate with the more diehard segregationists, who were more interested in preserving the traditional racial order than they were in what other countries thought of the United States. Wallace, however, was an expert at connecting the Civil War to the civil rights struggle in a different way, by charging that the campaign for racial justice was a communist plot to destroy American freedoms and the integrity of the white race. Now, red baiting has a long history in the US. Wallace certainly didn't invent it. Previous generations of white supremacists had effectively used it for decades to destroy the credibility of outspoken Black leaders. And as early as the 1930s, white Southerners began to connect the ideals of the Confederacy to the emerging anti-communist crusade. They began to use different wording in their condemnation of Reconstruction in particular, shifting from older critiques like corruption and Black domination to governmental tyranny, violation of individual liberties, and centralized economic planning. Wallace began his speech at the South Carolina Monument by railing against the dangers of international communism and condemning the Civil Rights Bill recently sent to Congress as a step toward totalitarianism. Confederates, he implied, had been the original anti-communists, sacrificing their lives in defense of individual liberties, local control, and a world in which hierarchy was both expected and protected. Wallace praised modern-day white Southerners for upholding the essential anti-communism of their Confederate forebears and called on political conservatives around the country to support the Deep South's resistance to the destructive centralization, as he called it, that was destroying constitutional government and individual rights across the United States. Now, in inviting Wallace to speak at their monument dedication, the South Carolina Gettysburg Monument Commission made it clear that they saw a connection between the Confederate cause and Southern resistance to the civil rights movement. The governor's reception in Gettysburg, though, is a reminder that his neo-Confederate interpretation of states' rights had currency nationwide in 1963. He was a celebrity here. Crowds mobbed him in the lobby of the Hotel Gettysburg, begging him to sign their anniversary programs. Reenactors mobbed him for pictures. There are stories of reenactors, sign my kepi, sign my gun, sign my social security card, all sorts of things. At the Peace Light ceremony that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, when governors and official representatives from all participating states were introduced, the crowd cheered loudest for Wallace. The governor's language was more coded in Gettysburg than it was in Alabama, but white conservatives, North and South alike, embraced his equation of the Confederacy with anti-communism and political conservatism, and Black freedom with subversion, with some later embracing him on his runs for the White House. Okay, very briefly, the last major component of the 1963 anniversary was the Centennial commemoration of the Gettysburg Address. The observance began with a program devoted to the international aspects of the address, headlined by Secretary of State Dean Rusk. And joining Rusk on the platform were the modern counterparts of 3 European dignitaries who attended the 1863 dedication. Rusk began his remarks by discussing the contemporary impact of the address around the globe, arguing that the speech had become the avenue through which U.S. commitment to freedom and democracy was best known to citizens of other countries. Taking this line of reasoning one step further, the Secretary of State alleged that these Lincolnian commitments to freedom are the source of our foreign policy and the basis of U.S. opposition to colonialism. They also, he insisted, explain our concern about our failures here at home to live up fully to our own great commitments. Now, Rusk acknowledged that American race relations were under global scrutiny and actively being used by Soviet and Chinese propagandists to spread distrust of the United States. He knew this well. The State Department was on the front lines of complaints from around the world, and recently had to create a new office to help dark-skinned diplomats from these newly independent countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America navigate the still largely segregated landscape of Washington, D.C. Despite that, unlike Sam Gibbons, Rusk ultimately argued that international opinion was not the primary reason that discrimination needed to end. The main reason, he concluded, was it was long past time for the United States to complete the work that had begun with the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address. The 3 European diplomats who followed him echoed similar ideas, with the ambassador from Italy insisting that the safety and security of the modern world depended on American military might employed in the service of the ideals of the Gettysburg Address. Okay, so in looking back on the Gettysburg Centennial from the vantage point of 2022, as is true with examining anything in hindsight, including hairstyles and fashion trends, it is easy to see the missteps. The use of orange World War I era smoke grenades as part of a theater program during the battle anniversary was definitely a mistake, as was the decision to fire cannon in Lincoln Square, which ended up shattering windows across downtown. One of my interviewees for this project, a former high school history teacher who was drafted to participate in that theater program that I mentioned, told me that after experiencing the Civil War 150th, the Centennial anniversary seemed even more like, this is his quote, someone was writing a golden book about Gettysburg. It's impossible to deny that the Cold War narrative of patriotic unity and American greatness fixed significant limits on how the history of the battle and the address could be interpreted. But despite its obvious shortcomings, the concept of a usable past infused the Gettysburg Centennial with contemporary meaning, transforming it into a vehicle to at least begin to address things like racial injustice and foreign policy concerns and the proper relationship between state and federal authority, or even the future of the United States. The history explored and commemorated here in 1963 was, in the end, far from antiquarian or irrelevant. For better or for worse, the Gettysburg Centennial played an important role in forging narratives about the American nation, which were used to champion racial equality and strengthen the U.S. position internationally, as well as to provide cover for anti-federal sentiments and activities. Both the Gettysburg Address and the suffering and perceived devotion to duty of the soldiers who fought the battle were broadcast around the world as hallmarks of American national character that would save the globe from creeping totalitarianism. Racial injustice complicated that narrative, for sure. But the fact that so many Americans, North and South, white and black, shared a desire to claim the Gettysburg Address as the central philosophical underpinning of American foreign policy, though certainly not all for the same reasons, further elevated Gettysburg's place in the national narrative. As civil rights activists around the country forced white Americans to confront the failure of democratic self-government in their own communities, North and South, sometimes connecting the Civil War to the present to the Civil War past, like Martin Luther King Jr. did in this open letter to Kennedy. The iconography of Gettysburg helped create additional space for mainstream civil rights leaders and their allies to win public and governmental support for limited civil rights reform and introduced more white Americans to the emancipationist memory of the Civil War. This quote has sort of emerged for me as the backbone to my scholarly work. My first book was on Prince Edward County. My second book is on Gettysburg. So I'm thinking the third book, Montgomery, Lookout Mountain, I mean, probably one of the two. So thank you so much for having me today, and if there are time for questions, I would love to discuss things further. Yes, back there.
Did you look into any of the coverage done by the national news networks on how they were looking at this event, this commemoration?
I did, yes. I looked at coverage from some of the major papers across the country, and there was real variety. This sort of connection to the Cold War and this idea of what does commemorating the Battle of Gettysburg mean in the present was a theme that many reporters picked up on. The Boston Globe during the battle anniversary even ran a front page article that argued that the Civil War suggested that conflict was not irrepressible. There was this whole debate among historians in the early decades of the 20th century about, is the Civil War an irrepressible conflict? Did the nation have to have this war or not? And by the 1960s, a lot of scholars were saying, this is pretty irrepressible. Like, this war almost had to happen based on the way that the U.S. was set up. But previously, there had been a whole generation of scholars that said, the Civil War didn't have to happen. It was the result of a blundering generation of politicians. If they had just been smarter and more willing to compromise, the whole war wouldn't have happened. And so the Boston Globe puts this front page article it's July 1st or July 2nd, saying, we understand that the scholarship is going away from this now, but we take comfort from the idea that if the Civil War didn't have to happen, that means that nuclear war doesn't have to happen either. If there was a way out of the Civil War, there's a way out of nuclear annihilation for the world. A lot of the other coverage, another big theme is commercialism. There's a lot of critiques of what people see as unchecked commercialism and a profit motive. There's a lot of people saying, these theater programs that I referenced, they're tacky, they're historically inaccurate. It's absolutely reprehensible that you can buy, that you are like standing on this ground where so many people have died, and you can buy a snow cone and you can buy a kepi and you can run across it with your pop gun and things. And then there are other people saying, look, this is who we are as a country. We are a consumer society that needs to be entertained. And if we're going to engage with our history in any way, we have to embrace that. There's all the coverage of the November Centennial, though, is a little bit more universally positive. Commentators around the country seem to think that Gettysburg got it right in November in a way that they did not in July. It was more intellectual, it was more low-key, it was a lot less commercialized, it was more tied to foreign policy. Now, that does not necessarily mean, though, that your average American family who came to Gettysburg during this year would have preferred the November activities over the July ones, but that's what a lot of the newspaper commentators did prefer.
All right, folks, well, thank you all so much again for coming, and we hope to see you tomorrow for Ranger Tom Holbrook's presentation about some of the museum collections that we have in storage. So hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.